Report 1. Christmas has always been my favorite time of year. I loved the lights, the presents, and above all, gathering the family around the table. But after that night, I never looked at Christmas dinner the same way again. Because that night, what began as a happy celebration turned into something that haunts me to this day. My family always gathers at my grandparents' house for dinner. It was a tradition. They lived in an old but cozy house in the countryside, with walls lined with old photos and furniture that seemed to belong to another era. The place had a rustic charm and a peculiar atmosphere at night. That year, the dinner would be special. My grandfather had passed away months earlier, and we all wanted to support my grandmother. My mother, my brother, and I arrived early to help with the preparations. While we set the table, my grandmother confided that she'd been hearing noises around the house in the past few weeks. Footsteps, furniture moving, and even soft voices. We thought it was just loneliness or sadness from the loss of my grandfather and tried to change the subject. When the other family members arrived, the house became livelier. Laughter, conversations, and the smell of food filled the air. For a while, everything felt normal. But then, things began to change. The first strange thing happened during dinner. We were all seated at the table, eating and chatting, when the kitchen door opened quietly. A cold breeze swept into the room, making the candles on the table flicker. My uncle got up to close the door, but returned looking puzzled. "I could have sworn I locked that door," he murmured. We laughed, saying he must have forgotten. But that unsettling feeling that something was wrong lingered in the air. Then came the sound. It was subtle, like someone scratching wood. We stopped talking for a moment, trying to identify where it was coming from. "It must be a rat," my mother suggested, trying to ease the tension. But the scratching continued, growing louder, until it sounded like fingernails scraping against the basement door. My brother volunteered to check it out. He stood up, opened the basement door, and took a flashlight. "There's nothing down here," he said, but his voice sounded strange, almost hesitant. When he returned to the table, he was pale. He said he felt like someone was down there, even though he saw nothing. We tried to continue dinner, but everyone was uncomfortable. My grandmother began to cry softly, saying she felt my grandfather's presence in the house. We tried to calm her down, but the energy in the room had already turned heavy. That's when we heard a sound that made everyone stop breathing, a low moan coming from the basement. This time, no one volunteered to check it out. We sat there, looking at each other, until the lights flickered and went out. The only light came from the candles on the table. In the almost complete silence, we heard footsteps coming from the basement. Slow, dragging footsteps ascending the stairs. My mother held my hand so tightly it nearly hurt. "It can't be," she whispered. The sound continued, getting closer, until the basement door creaked open slowly. The nearest candle flickered and almost went out, and then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, but soon it took shape. A tall, thin man dressed in old-fashioned clothes stood in the doorway. The most terrifying part was his face, or the lack of one. There were no features, just smooth skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should be. Everyone froze. My grandmother let out a muffled scream and fainted. My uncle tried to get up but stumbled over his chair. The figure began to move slowly, coming toward the table. That's when I ran. I dashed for the front door, pulling my mother with me. My brother followed, carrying my grandmother in his arms. Everyone else ran after us, not looking back. We burst into the street and didn't stop until we reached the car. We called the police, but when we returned home, there was no sign of anyone. The basement was empty, the candles extinguished, and the table still set, as if nothing had happened. But no one wanted to stay there. My grandmother moved out the following week, and the house was sold. Since that night, none of us talk about what happened. My grandmother insists it was my grandfather's spirit trying to communicate, but I don't believe it. That thing didn't feel human. And sometimes, especially at Christmas, I still dream of that faceless figure standing in the basement doorway, waiting. I have never participated in a Christmas dinner at someone else's house since then. And every time I hear a scratching sound on wood or a noise coming from the basement, I remember that night, because I know deep down that what we saw is still there, waiting for another dinner to continue what it started. Report 2. Christmas has always been synonymous with joy in my family. Presents, laughter, and abundant food. But that year, everything changed. It was the last time we celebrated together, and if I could go back in time, I would have locked the door. It was Christmas night, and the house was full. My parents, uncles, cousins, and I gathered at my grandmother's house, as we did every year. Her house was small but cozy, with twinkling lights on the Christmas tree and the smell of turkey roasting in the oven. It was everything you could hope for on a happy night. But there was something different that year, something I can't explain. From the moment we arrived, I felt a weight in my chest, as if something was out of place. I tried to ignore it and focus on the celebration, but that feeling only grew stronger. My grandmother had mentioned seeing a man standing outside the house earlier, but no one paid it any mind. Maybe it was just a neighbor, she said. She seemed uncomfortable, but inviting, not wanting to spoil the mood. I should have realized then that something was wrong. The quiet night continued normally until around 11 p.m. We were in the living room exchanging gifts when we heard a doorbell ring. Everyone looked at each other, surprised. Who could be coming at this hour? My uncle volunteered to answer, but when he opened the door, there was no one there. The cold wind swept into the room, and my aunt quickly shut the door. We joked about it possibly being kids playing pranks, but 15 minutes later the doorbell rang again. This time, I went to the door. I opened it slowly, expecting to see someone there, but the porch was empty. I looked around, but there was no sign of movement. I closed the door, feeling a strange chill. Before I could return to the living room, the doorbell rang again, this time repeatedly, as if someone were persistently pressing the button. I opened the door again, but what I saw made me freeze. At the end of the walkway, there was a figure standing still. I couldn't make out its face because it was dark, but I could see that it was tall and wearing a thick coat with a hood covering its head. I stood there, waiting for it to say something, but the figure just stayed there, staring at me. My mother came to the door and asked what was happening. When she looked outside, the figure was no longer there. "Are you okay?" she said, noticing my pale face. I nodded and tried to forget about it, but the night only got worse. Shortly after midnight, we heard loud banging at the back door. My grandmother panicked, and everyone rushed to see. The door was locked, but the banging continued. My uncle grabbed a knife from the kitchen and opened the door at once, but no one was there, just footprints in the snow leading into the forest behind the house. We called the police, but they said it would take a while to arrive because the road was covered in snow. While we waited, we locked all the doors and windows. We sat in the living room, all nervous, until the doorbell rang again. This time, no one had the courage to open it. We sat in silence, listening to the banging increase. Then it stopped, but the worst was yet to come. One of the kids started crying, pointing at the living room window. When we looked, we saw a face pressed against the glass, pale with deep-set eyes and a smile too wide to be normal. Before anyone could react, the face disappeared. The police arrived about an hour later and searched the area. They found no one, but there were footprints around the house, as if someone had been circling the place repeatedly. They told us it was probably a homeless person looking for shelter, but I knew it was more than that. The next morning, I found a present left on the porch. It was wrapped in red paper and tied with a black ribbon. No one had the courage to open it, and my uncle burned the package in the backyard. To this day, we don't know what was inside. We never returned to that house for Christmas again. My grandmother moved away a few months later, saying she felt something was still there, watching. And honestly, I believe her. To this day, I can't hear the sound of a doorbell without feeling the same chill from that night, because no matter how hard we try to forget, we all know that whatever knocked on the door that Christmas night is still out there, and maybe it's waiting to come back. Report. That Christmas, everything seemed perfect. Lights twinkled throughout the house. The table was abundant and Christmas music softly echoed. But what started as a calm celebration quickly turned into something I would give anything to forget, all because of a gift that should never have been opened. My family always took Christmas seriously. It was the only time of year when everyone gathered. That night began like any other, laughter, old stories, and children running around the living room. The tree was full of presents and the fireplace crackled, spreading a cozy warmth throughout the room. Around 9 p.m., we started opening presents. Each package revealed something expected: clothes, toys, books. But then, a gift that no one had identified caught our attention. It was small, wrapped in shiny black paper, with no tag or name. We asked whose it was, but everyone denied bringing it. My grandfather, always playful, said it must be a gift from Santa Claus. We laughed, and my youngest cousin, eager, offered to open it. If we had known what that would bring, we would have burned the package without even touching it. Inside the box was a strange doll. Small, made of dark wood, with glassy eyes and a carved smile that looked wrong, as if it had been hastily chiseled. On its chest was a symbol that no one recognized, a circle crossed by irregular lines. My uncle laughed and said it looked like a relic from some flea market. He placed the doll on a shelf next to the tree and changed the subject. But as we tried to continue the evening, I began to notice an odd atmosphere. The lights flickered several times. The music, which had been cheerful, began to rise slowly and distorted, as if the device was malfunctioning. My younger cousins grew restless and started saying the doll was looking at them. We tried to calm them down, but even the adults seemed uneasy and uncomfortable. It was then that we heard the first sound. It sounded like scratching coming from inside the wall, behind the tree. My dad went to check, but found nothing. We said it was just the wind, or perhaps a mouse. But the scratching grew louder, as if something was trying to get out. My mum suggested we continue the party, but no one could relax. My uncles began to fidget, and I went to the kitchen to get some water. That's when I noticed the doll was no longer on the shelf. I returned to the living room, asking who had moved it. Everyone looked at me confused. The last time anyone had seen the doll was on the shelf, but now it was nowhere to be found. We started searching for it, but in the midst of the search, the lights went out. The only illumination came from the candles on the table. The festive mood turned into tension. It was then that we heard footsteps, quick, light footsteps, like a child running upstairs. My dad went up with a flashlight but returned a few minutes later, pale. "There's no one up there," he said, "but all the doors are open." Suddenly we heard something fall in the living room. When we looked, the doll was back, on the floor facing the tree. But now the symbol on its chest looked darker, as if it had been burned into the wood. My grandmother began to pray, and my uncle picked up the doll to throw it in the fire. But as soon as he touched it, the front door burst open with a bang, and a cold wind swept into the room. The candles went out, leaving us in darkness. Everyone screamed, and in the confusion we heard the most terrifying sound of the night, a low, almost childlike laugh, but devoid of emotion. We ran out of the house, called the police, and waited in the car until they arrived. They found no one inside, but the doll had vanished. Since that night, my family has never celebrated Christmas in that house again. My uncle sold the property a few months later, but that didn't erase the memories. Even now, sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I am being watched, because no matter how hard we try to forget that cursed gift, we know it is still out there. And the worst part, no one knows who it will be delivered to this year.